No, that's okay. You can stand wherever you want. It's your show. I'm just here. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Katie O'Donnell. I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose, where we now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, I do want to just take care of a few housekeeping items. I'd like to ask that you please silence your cell phones to not disrupt the event. While we've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, we do ask that you are encouraged to wear a mask throughout the event to help keep our authors safe, and we do have masks provided at the front of the store for your convenience. When we get to the time for opening the floor to audience questions, we've placed a standing microphone to your right, or my left, right here. We do ask that you please line up at one of these mics so that everyone can hear your question, as well as we can capture your question in the audio recording of the event. We are both audio and video recording this evening so that you or anyone you know can find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we will have a signing line that will begin at this podium and will take place here at the table. So if you have not already purchased a book, we do have many copies at the front behind the front registers. We'll ask that you line up starting at the pillar, and one of our staff members will come by and ask for your name for personalizations. Once the event is complete, we do ask that you fold up your chairs and place them against something sturdy to help our staff out at the end of the evening. So now on to the better part of this introduction. Tonight, I am honored to welcome Michelle Wilde Anderson, celebrating the release of The Fight to Save the Town, Reimagining Discarded America. Published earlier this summer, The Fight to Save the Town is a sweeping and authoritative study of wealth inequality and the dismantling of local government in 4 working-class cities across the U.S. that passionately argues for reinvestment in people-centered leadership. Sherry Turkle wrote in the New York Times Book Review that Anderson's book is an artful mixture of ethnography, narrative history, in-depth interviews, and legal scholarship. Using these tools, she shows us what the absence of government looks like on the ground. Michelle is a professor of property, local government, and environmental justice at Stanford Law School, and her previous work has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Yale Law Journal, and other publications. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Michelle Wilde Anderson.
You all made time to come out tonight. It's incredibly generous of you, and I think symbolic of the fact that everybody in this room is probably engaged in a fight to save the town in some setting, and I'm dying to get to Q&A so that I'm going to try that again with a proper thank you. I'm so glad you're here tonight. I am dying to hear your questions. Because I think you all have a lot to bring to this conversation. So I look forward to that piece of it. I also want to thank Politics and Prose. This is such an extraordinary civic space. It's actually known nationwide. And as you'll hear, I feel like this book is in part about finding new models to thread our civic society back together. And I think Politics and Prose is such a standout example of how to do that, at least in a really big city. Also, I am limping a tiny bit because I broke a toe in the Pacific Ocean on Sunday, which reminds me that I'm from very far away, and I felt the presence of that fact here too. This is the first time I've been to DC since before the fall 20 election and the January 6th insurrection, and I feel the weight of those events in your city. I'm also very aware that many people in the audience are probably may not be involved in DC politics directly, but are involved in federal politics or have family members who are doing that work. And while this book is not a book about federal solutions, being here in DC really reminds me how grateful I am for all the people that are fighting to save the Union. At that beach trip last week, I did see my first all-black flag in California. And so much of the work that's going on in this city is exceptionally important. The book's title has two parts. It's called The Fight to Save the Town, Reimagining Discarded America. And I want to start with the second part, the Discarded America part. That is a national problem that I'm going to describe for you in a minute. And I want to say before I really jump into that the federal government has such an important role to play in this work. But as a writer raised and rooted in the West, and especially as a reporter on the places in this book, I'm really aware of how federal policy is weak and often quite mistrusted when there aren't strong networks of trust and cooperation on the ground. So again, while this is a talk that's really not about federal policy, I feel very much that I'm speaking in the shadow of federal policy, not intending to push away from the federal government, but rather to say that without durable partnerships and the rebuilding of trust on the ground, so many of the things that happen in this city just don't make it across the finish line. So what is that problem, the discarded America problem? As many of you know personally from your families and your hometowns, huge sections of most states in the country have not found a foothold in the 21st century service economy. So we have these giant metro engines that are driving so much of our economic growth, including the one here. But there's huge territory beyond these metro engines that is really struggling. Much of their workforce commutes out to jobs if they're close enough for that. They lose a lot of their college-seeking youth to other places and have trouble drawing them back to work in town, which leads to a sinking of the college attainment rate. So this is kind of the big regional problem. But if that problem sits around for long enough, a town, and many of these problems have been sitting around for 10, 30, 40 years, their local government can also go broke. This is the larger problem of so much poverty concentrating into a tax base, both pockets of very intensive poverty, but also a slumping all across the city or county of the median income, that their people stay poor in part because their governments are broke. And so this book is really at the big picture, a sort of argument about America as a nation of local government haves and have-nots, and what that means for safety and opportunity. I want to just bring this to ground in an example. I work in Palo Alto, which, as you all probably know, is a very wealthy town. And Palo Alto invested recently a round of $76 million in its library system, state-of-the-art facilities and technology for its not only its equipment and computers, but its Wi-Fi, programs for children, and vibrant public spaces, simulating some of what we're doing here. But meanwhile, Palo Alto is the home to hospitals and restaurants and businesses that rely on a low-wage workforce that are coming in from elsewhere. They can't afford to live in Palo Alto. And one of the places they're coming in from is the city of Stockton, which to commute to Palo Alto from Stockton is a good 3 hours a day away from your children. Very long distances in order to reach these low-wage opportunities in Palo Alto. But across the period when Palo Alto was building out this magnificent public library system, Stockton was retracting its whole library system, cutting hours, depleting the main branch, and closing a branch in its poorest neighborhood. And I think folks can really picture the way that ultimately libraries are less central to opportunity in Palo Alto than in Stockton. Families in Palo Alto, by and large, can afford to purchase books here. They have private computers. Palo Alto has a magnificent network of public Wi-Fi, but people also have home Wi-Fi. In Stockton, those substitutes for a public library are not there in the same way. So this retreat of the public sector in a very poor place is an opportunity problem. And that's really ultimately what this book is about, the way that that people in poor places stay poor in part because their governments are broke, and what we're going to do about that intergenerational problem of poverty. It turns out that places that have this problem, that are both poor and broke, are really diverse. They run from super rural to super big city urban, with all kinds of small towns and inner ring suburbs in between. They run from very Republican to very Democratic to swing purple. And they also run from all white to all black to mostly Latino, or just magnificently diverse. And this problem, I think, has been poorly understood and poorly recognized. So we don't have a lot of work sort of building out our data or understanding of how many places have this problem nationwide. But this book itself is really not a problem-centered book. It's really trying to focus on the solutions. I heard again and again in my reporting for this book that we don't have time to just talk about these problems. We have to have answers now. And this book ultimately is rooted in 4 places that are not only poor and broke, but they're also progressing. And they're progressing because leaders have really worked together to develop answers to some of our hardest problems of poverty. The first of these places, I'm going to introduce them really quickly, say a little bit about their the progress that they're making, and then I'm going to read a quick excerpt from one of them that is very much on my mind as the January 6th trials go on here in DC. So the first is Josephine County, Oregon, which has it has most of the poorest census tracts in the state of Oregon. And that level of poverty has driven a collapse in public services that makes its local government unrecognizable to those of us who live in kind of more typical locales, but is actually quite typical of most of the rural South, of rural Appalachia, and much of the Rocky Mountain West, and is increasingly typical of Northern California and inner California as well, my backyard. So while Josephine is an extreme experiment in government retreat, it is certainly not alone. The book is also about Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is, like all the places that I write about, stigmatized constantly in the media, including a Boston Magazine article that referred to it as City of the Damned, which was truly personally devastating to people in the community. But former President Trump, several governors in New England, and others have also centered Lawrence as responsible for the New England opioid crisis. And so that's the sort of public conversation that gets had about this small mill town in Massachusetts. But meanwhile, Lawrence on the ground is a city struggling with low-wage jobs, working in the Route 128 corridor, where Andover and a lot of the big tech businesses of the Massachusetts Miracle are located. They work as nannies, waitresses, Uber Eats drivers across the pandemic, dishwashers, and so forth. This is a city of immigrants. It is a city of parents and children, and it is nicknamed the Latino city. It is a predominantly Latino city that has manifestations of the kind of just the history of American relationships with the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico everywhere in the city and the cultural vitality there. The book is also rooted in Stockton, and Stockton too is just pilloried online. People joke on Twitter that you need a bulletproof vest to attend sporting events there. But meanwhile, Stockton is the most racially and ethnic diverse city in America. 325,000 people. It would be a big city in any state except for California. We have enough big cities that it gets kind of lower on the pecking order, but it is an important city. It should be a well-known city. And a jewel and a testing ground for the project of religious freedom, immigrant integration, and racial desegregation. And last but definitely not least, this book is about Detroit, a place that, as you know, was once this a symbolic capital of the American middle class, but now should be understood as a capital of American inequality. a city that is one of the most important centerpieces of the Great Migration and the Black struggle to make it into northern industrial cities to escape Jim Crow violence and get out from the underhang of sharecropping debt and debt peonage. But it is now a capital of Black land loss after the Great Recession. So we're watching just hemorrhaging Black homeownership rates in particular in this city that is so important to Black history and American history. So these places are up against formidable challenges, but they're doing something about this. And each chapter really focuses on one centerpiece of the challenges of this kind of chronic poverty. The Josephine chapter, as you'll hear, focuses on rebuilding falling public services in a place with historic levels of mistrust in government. So it's really, as you'll hear, about how you run a pro-tax campaign in one of the most anti-government places in America. Should be obvious why it's on my mind sitting here in our nation's capital. And it's about the work in Stockton to treat the traumatic impacts of gun violence as a way of actually, as an anti-violence agenda going forward, of really treating the root causes of gun violence, of really wrapping around families and children who have witnessed and experienced gun violence and have lost family members to our prevailing answer to gun violence, which has been incarceration, and really trying to develop answers to this problem beyond the police department. It's really a chapter sort of sitting with the deeper healing work and neighborhood reconstruction that has to happen in the context of decades of violence. The Lawrence chapter is focused on how in 2022, and this whole period I wrote about, the post-recession period, to get adult wages up. And it's a very interesting city to do that, I can't resist saying, because Lawrence was the home of this incredible strike in 1912 that helped build a template for union-based labor organizing. And it was the hub, it was their strike, the Bread and Roses strike of 1912, yielded a 15% rise in wages in the textile industry across New England. And so this chapter is really sitting with how you do that now, how you do that in a period without the levels of unionization that we're used to, how you do that in a place where so many of your residents are going somewhere else for their jobs. The local government can't just regulate its way to this because its workers are not even working, its residents are not working in town. So it's this magnificent story of really investing in people to get out of low-wage employment and into better jobs. And last but not least, again, the Detroit chapter is about stabilizing families against an ongoing foreclosure crisis. And Detroit represents a larger level of speculation in single-family real estate that's going on in the country, and a larger pattern of foreclosures that continues to this day. It has unfortunately far outlasted the subprime lending crisis of the Great Recession. And that chapter is really about how you defend against these foreclosures, how you figure out what is even going on in obtuse and invisible real estate markets, and how you change with every lever available to the local government the forces driving those foreclosures. Last but not least, it is about some fledgling efforts in the city to really to enact a restorative justice vision of land ownership and really try to repair Black land loss through a local reparations model. So that's the sort of big sweep of the book. I wanted to, again, because being here sort of puts me in the shadow of January 6th, and I was at the federal courthouse today where the January 6th trials are ongoing. And Josephine County in Oregon is known as a place that has strong Oath Keeper chapters. It's a hub of Liberty Watch and other more far-right groups in the state of Oregon and also across the West. Josephine itself has been wrapped up in some of the big protests against the Bureau of Land Management that are grouped together as sort of the ongoing sagebrush rebellion. And so it is really a place where I feel like it was this incredible window in how you think about rebuilding trust in government in a place where government is understood to have cost the region tremendous amount of jobs through environmental law and through globalization. The federal government, needless to say, is not a happy phrase in southern and eastern Oregon. So this is just the beginning of the Josephine chapter, which is called Man in the Arena. Many other places in America would call Grave Creek a river, but it's small by comparison to the Rogue, which the Grave joins in a torrent of whitecaps. The creek is named after a 16-year-old pioneer named Martha Leland Crowley, who died there of typhoid fever in 1846. Her fiancé marked her grave with a wooden headstone, which served for many years as a trail marker for the wagon trains following behind. In 2009, a 20-year-old woman named Caitlin Strausser also lost her life at Grave Creek. Her boyfriend, Joey Odell, was wanted on drug possession and auto theft charges. According to a detective on the case, she was trying to persuade Odell to turn himself in. He had agreed, and the night before her death, they camped in his truck near the shore. The next morning, they argued. Strausser ran. Odell caught up to her. In a methamphetamine fuel rage, he killed her with a rock. People who loved Strausser, including her mother, heard what Odell had done. They also knew about his struggle with addiction and his own brutal past. When Odell was a boy, his father was fatally shot by a man protecting Odell's mother from domestic violence. His mother was then killed in an unsolved murder near railroad tracks when Odell was 14. In the aftermath of Strausser's death, with Odell on the run from the law, Strausser's mother and other locals spoke with him. Yet for weeks they refused to speak with the police. The rural township of Wolf Creek, where Strausser and Odell had lived, had long subsisted off the grid of just about any public services. Most residents preferred to keep it that way. As many locals say with both pride and shame, rural Josephine is a rough-and-tumble place. On the cover of A History of the County, a sepia-toned photo depicts a pioneer couple standing 2 feet apart in front of a canvas tent. Wearing smudged overalls, the man is unsmiling beneath his beard. His wife's face is as stern as her woolen skirt. She's holding a 32-inch rifle. Maud and William Bigelow enjoy the natural beauty of Josephine County, the caption reads without irony. Maud's warning face pretends the politics of the county's libertarian conservative majority. But her photograph also captures the fierce independence of the region's lefty farm and forest communes. At the Magic Forest Farm, a housing collective founded in 1967, residents seem to capture Josephine's wider culture with the farm's operating principle. If you want a cup of coffee, go find an axe. So it was that Josephine managed a radical experiment in local government downsizing. In recent decades, budget cuts eliminated most local public functions other than law enforcement, then leveled law enforcement too. For years, the county ran by these principles of independence. If you want a library, volunteer for one and fundraise private dollars to support it. If you want to reduce break-ins to cars and homes, volunteer to patrol your streets at night. If you want emergency law enforcement and dispatch, sign up and take your neighbor's calls on your cell phone and dispatch with your own gun. The remaining local officials, however, still had to govern. The words "man in the arena" float around as the screensaver message on Josephine County Sheriff Dave Daniels' desktop. He keeps it as a reminder of Teddy Roosevelt's speech celebrating the man who is not just a critic, but who, quote, strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again because there's no effort without error or shortcoming. The sheriff has to be like that, a man who fights from within government, trying to hold on to at least a night watchman's state as politics and funding tighten around him. We're driving an 18-wheeler, and we've got 10 wheels on right now, maybe 9, Sheriff Daniel told me in 2016. Back then, Sheriff Daniel was bracing for even further cuts. The federal government had been sending special funding to Josephine and other timber counties in Oregon for more than 20 years, but those payments were sure to end. Federal funding dated back to an infamously polarizing environmental conflict, the battle over logging the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the endangered northern spotted owl nests in one of the world's most complex ecosystems. Recompense for the lost jobs and public revenues could not go on forever, but neither could Josephine easily replace federal dollars. A 1990s tax revolt enshrined in the Oregon Constitution cinched Josephine in a legal straitjacket by locking local revenues into an unsustainably low rate and requiring voter majority approval of any increases. Given those tax laws, it wasn't enough that Sheriff Daniel and other government officials believed that the cuts had gone too far. To do something about it, they had to build a grassroots movement in favor of new taxes in one of the most anti-government places in America. You can still make your own damn coffee, they argued, but a local government needs some trained patrol officers to dispatch for 911 calls. It needs the kind of investigators who can coax witnesses and family members out of the shadows in cases like Caitlin Strausser's murder. Josephine has become a pioneer county once again. Its residents have been called upon to restore the public law enforcement that their gold rush forefathers built 150 years ago, or to let it go. So that chapter really sits with the experimentation toward building a local campaign by facing the public with the rot in our relationship to government. It really is a campaign about public officials, including the sheriff himself, going to one town hall after another and listening to the origins and the bases for people's mistrust of government, their ideas that government had separate money stashed somewhere else, or that really the government just needed money because it's empire building for the unions, or it's, driving lavish cars, or has, an excessively nice staff kitchen. There's all these theories about why government doesn't need money in an environment like that. And public officials really had to talk those challenges through. They had to take responsibility for their predecessors who had mismanaged parts of the county. They had to take responsibility for past acts of just antagonism between law enforcement and the general public. And I really came to see in sitting with Josephine the way that our crisis of trust in government that we feel so strongly being here in DC is not just at the top of our system, it's actually at the base of our system too. And I've come to believe that if you're really going to treat that problem, you have to address some of that damage at the local level. It can't all be about media and federal politics or even state politics. And so I'm going to wrap up with just saying three other things that really just 2.5, that I learned reporting this book that sort of constitute the biggest picture of how you restore this kind of trust. And one of them I like to think of as mutual aid for civil society. We talked so much during the pandemic, as you know, about mutual aid on the one-on-one level of sort of buying groceries for an elderly person who was under a shelter-in-place order. But we need mutual aid at the institutional level too, and especially in places where nonprofits have been under conditions of scarcity for so long. Poverty breeds it can breed and support a lot of cooperation and positive interdependence, but it can also cause so much negative competition, mistrust, and just kind of scrappy scarcity behavior. And so part of this mutual aid that I really came to observe in all 4 of these places is about how you bring rooms just like this together of different, the vocational college and the community colleges, churches, nonprofits, and general purpose government leaders like the mayor's office and so forth to learn to talk to each other, to learn how to text each other again and get things done sort of cooperatively, really relying on one another. That, by the way, I think is overwhelmingly the lesson, that federal dollars to work on the ground, they have to land in networks like that where people are habituated to working together and they trust one another. So it's really about that mutual aid. Secondly, it is fundamentally about investing in the residents a place has. And I say that very much, again, aware of where I'm standing right now, a city that has been famous for gentrification and so much displacement and mistrust that has come from that history of gentrification. I think it reminds us that American cities of all income levels have become very good at trying to replace their residents. That has been overwhelmingly the answer to concentrated poverty in a lot of cities for a long time, at least in downtown pockets or radiating out from a downtown pocket. How do you actually just drive up the averages in your overall poverty rates by bringing in more higher income residents? And that kind of strategy is the reason that, as I said before, Detroit is, I think, our capital of American inequality today, that it has this downtown revival surrounded by a sea of very intensive intergenerational poverty that is almost completely unaffected by that revival in the downtown core. So how do you do something different? How do you really invest in the people of a place, in their safety, in their opportunity? And I think to do that, I mean, the whole book is that, but I'll just say super big picture, the way you do that, I think, is you have to invest in very long-term solutions that are not susceptible to a press release or a ribbon cutting or a 3-year cycle. You have to really invest in projects that are about the seeds of change. And people talked about that in their interviews everywhere. And I'm going to give the last word, or almost the last word, on how you do this to the former mayor of Lawrence, a magnificent mayor who really, I think, was a model for the country in addressing these kinds of problems. And I want you to picture Mayor Rivera's office, which had a giant whiteboard next to a big conference table where he'd bring constituents and he'd bring community members. And he'd written a message off to the side that really acknowledges that he as a local government can't do everything. He cannot get a grip solely on the opioid crisis raging across New England. He can't get a grip even necessarily on national patterns in homicide. There's so many things out of his control. But he really focused in that message on doing something anyway right now. And I think it's an admonition not just for people working in local politics, but those in federal politics as well. So the message said, in one color, do something. Can we do it today? That was blue. In red, it said, stop explaining the problem, start explaining the solution. And for good measure, in green, the bottom red, keep your head up. And Danny said that he put that keep your head up, his wife actually added keep your head up, in part because a city like Lawrence takes so much grief from the wider society. It's just constantly embattled in the way we tell stories about our communities. And keep your head up was really his wife's way of saying that this is about being proud of Lawrence, investing in Lawrence, and believing in its people, their capacity to change and to grow, and the city's capacity to do the same. So that's what this book is about, local networks for progress, which I've ultimately come to think of as safety nets, not just for the poor who live, or concentrated low-income communities who live in these places, but maybe eventually for our trust problems in our wider union. Thank you. I'm delighted to take your questions.
That was all very interesting. Our family business was in a place called Hudson, Massachusetts, which was a small version of the gritty mill town, 10,000 people in 1947. Two things you haven't mentioned. One is education, because that's a public responsibility. And the second thing is, I mean, we've had a whole series of books about the collapse of community. So Robert Putnam, Nicholas Kristof, and what always seems to happen is there's a big factory and it collapses. The big factory unionized, because there's nothing magic about manufacturing. It was the unions that kind of brought everybody and made a community. And it seems to me without the money that comes with either a factory or it could be a call center. You don't necessarily have to pay people at the call center $10 an hour. And you shouldn't need a union, but if we do have laws, and if we enforce them, then there could be a union. Something like the Amazon Center, the second center, it should have been in Detroit. Detroit had the airport, the seaport, all of that stuff. It had all the things that Amazon said were necessary. We don't need an Amazon here. We have plenty of white-collar jobs. And all it's going to do is run up the prices of real estate in Alexandria. Mm-hmm. So how do we it seems to me this won't work unless there's a big commercial center. And it's something like the Amazon Center. If you build it, they will come. Mm. If you put it in West Virginia, then the roads will be built. The supplier companies will come in. Now that we have a service economy, it seems like it should be easier to put big commercial stuff in a falling down place like Lawrence, and that without that, there's not enough money, and without the money, there's no community, and you have everybody doing drugs.
So I really appreciate that question, and there's no question that education sort of runs through the center of our opportunity problems, full stop. And I'm enough of I'm a law professor, and so I'm enough of a sort of government researcher that the truth is that education is the only service. This may come as a surprise to some people in the room, but not my former students. Education is the only service that we have a state constitutional right to at the local level. I'm very aware in California, we definitely don't have a constitutional right to water. We have rules that apply to water once we provide it, but we don't have a right to water. We don't have a right to law enforcement. We don't have a right to 911. We don't have a right to fire protection. In fact, there's many subscription services, including Josephine, that have grown up around the country where fire is an opt-in payment model. If you don't opt in, then that's on you. Education is the one thing that is built into our state constitutions. What we have for these other services is an expectation and an assumption that we will have rights to it. And so for that reason, because it's a legal obligation, and as many of you know, education has gone through a larger equalization movement. It's had all kinds of problems of its own. But there's a parallel world of law and reform that has gone on in education that has never been in the context of these other things. So the facile answer is that The Fight to Save the Schools is it's a separate book. It's something that I care deeply about. But in this book, I did work deeply on the problem of how you get local residents in Lawrence up into the good jobs with benefits that public school education still provides for its staff. And so part of what I describe in Lawrence is the adult education piece that meets the needs of public schools to provide culturally appropriate, racially diverse, and often bilingual education for students. And that is very much, in Lawrence, that is understood as a project that is not just about adults, it is very much about outcomes for kids. So it's a sort of integrated model. With respect to this issue of bigger businesses, there's no question that the prevailing model for really 30, 40 years has been that local governments are on the hunt for new jobs and new sources of revenue. And when you win a competition round like HQ2, many of you read about the Amazon HQ2 mayhem that really sort of broke out as local governments and states sort of climbed all over each other, discounting their deal to the point that, you know, most of these offers for Amazon to court Amazon did not pencil at any time horizon. But at the end of the day, you know, it all felt like it was for show, and Amazon sort of chose these sort of big
places
service
that
economy
didn't need
capitals.
anything more.
Yes, but I think it's really a reminder, HQ2 is such an important reminder that local governments have been playing that game. They've been competing with each other for so long. And, you know, here we are. I mean, this entire bookshelf could be full of urban scholars grieving these fights for big jobs and, you know, just the economic development wars for sports teams, for arenas, for big businesses. And I think what we haven't talked about enough, which again, Lawrence is just this masterful example of this, is how you sew the small business sector back together to focus on retention of existing businesses and really focus on recruiting smaller businesses that are likely to have smaller pools of employees one at a time, but really aggregate to really, you know, as you know, and maybe others can picture, an old mill town like Lawrence or a big manufacturing capital like Detroit is filled with these giant buildings that used to be, you know, integrated manufacturing operations.
Right.
And the vision in Lawrence today is that those giant mills, one of which at its peak was the same size as the Empire State Building if you had turned it on its side. So this is a giant amount of real estate, and to fill that with small businesses is a bold ambition indeed. And so they're really working on these models for collaboration and cooperation. And in so doing, in building social networks of friendship and cooperation, they also, I have to say, engage in a certain amount of shaming for businesses not to leave. Because when people are bound to each other, when they have real friendships, real relationships, they are more likely to take the next big sort of offer that's coming down the road.
But somebody needs to bring money into the community. I mean, my father was a small businessman in Hudson. But you need, they had 128 around them.
Yeah, no, the
But
small
you can't,
business lending.
small businesses have to have, somebody has to have money. Otherwise, they're just trading cheap services.
Yeah, no, I think actually I'm writing about this in the context of New Jersey and some mistakes that New Jersey made in its policy. But if you compare sort of small business focused efforts that have gone on in the city of Camden with the big ticket sort of incentive and subsidy efforts that the state of New Jersey has made, you see that at the end of the day, like the small business stuff isn't free, but it is cheap by comparison to hurling money at a multinational that could be operated anywhere. And I mean, and the Detroit, yes, there's lots more I could say about that, but it's very true.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about the lack of trust problem that you mentioned. You said a lot of the problem comes down to there not being enough trust even at that local level. And is that something that you found had grown as a problem over the last, 20, 30, 40 years? If so, what caused that? Mm-hmm. And what do you see as the ways to restore that? Are there examples that you cite of ways that are restoring it locally?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that all four of these places are really working on that problem. And here's why. But I think you guys all can appreciate, based on the places that I've mentioned or other chronically poor places that you know well, the way that stigma sort of sets in and hardens over time. And these narratives actually matter. They matter to people in the sort of humiliation that comes with them and from them. But also because it's really hard to imagine going into government when the outside, I'm only talking right now about outsiders and the sort of narratives of these problems, If those are the only stories we tell, it's hard to imagine going into government. You're under pressure and scrutiny and criticism constantly from outside. Reporters will only come to your town when something terrible happens. Meanwhile, your budget is rock bottom, and if anything, you more likely than not, you will be responsible for further budget cuts, like more blood from that stone as a leader. And I think as these problems have sat with us really since the 80s and they've gotten worse, it has become harder and harder to want to run for office or really be engaged in public life. From that, there are amazing public officials that do it anyway, and this book is full of them. So I'm not trying to say that everybody is corrupt or mismanaging these cities, but they have their share of bad apple leadership, and those stories are the ones that get reported on. Reporters come to Stockton when the homicide rate spikes. They definitely come every time a mayor leaves in handcuffs. So that, that's like a photogenic moment in local government politics. And they reinforce this story that this place is hopeless, that your best move is to get out of there as a kid or as an adult, as a parent. And I think they really, send communities like this onto a sort of vicious cycle of decline. And trust to me is one of these components that has to be rebuilt in order to shift that cycle and feel like there's momentum in the town, that people are working together and feel proud of their accomplishments. You really have to develop this kind of interpersonal connective tissue that I've described. In Lawrence, they refer to the cell phone test as a way of describing the rebuilding of trust in town, of really trying to maximize the number of leaders, of private sector leaders and public sector leaders who really can call on each other to get stuff done and know it's going to happen. Trust, I think, at the institutional level, and Dan Rivera would be the first to say this, is rebuilt by delivering every time on what you say you're going to do. And just rebuilding that basic sort of ambition and commitment to government. And I think that project of trust is exceptionally important because these cities are not places of no government. In fact, if you go to, Detroit is infamous for a collapse in local public services, but its eviction court, it's paused during the pandemic for public health reasons, but prior to the pandemic and now getting going again, it was processing evictions, 30,000 of them a year. That's government too. And environmental law, and law enforcement is government too. Detroit has an astronomical arrest rate of citizens in the city. So people very much feel the presence of government in their midst. In Josephine County, they feel the presence of government, as I mentioned, in the presence of global trade agreements, in the presence of environmental law that sort of controls the management of the big federal forests in the county. And so it's not that law is missing, it's that law is not doing anything to actually help you. Law is just there sort of punishing you, or, in the story that gets told in Josephine, costing your family an income. So I think it's at the biggest picture level, this is really about restoring people's faith in a version of government that is sort of there when you need them and there to sort of get you ahead and not sort of punish you. Ben, I get to call on you.
I'm so glad you remembered my name.
Of course I did.
Yes, not so long ago I was in your property class. I want the listeners to hear me say thank you for getting those exams back to us. I had a question not about law and policy, but perhaps writerly technique for those of us who may...
Yeah, you can tell already when the notepad in this question, Ben was a reporter before law school.
for those of us who may want to write a book, you mentioned Dave Daniels, you mentioned Dan Rivera, and so my question is about characters and how did you find them? what impact maybe they had on you, and how do you, or how did you go about the task of, funneling is the right word, but conveying, big ambient ideas about policy and law sort of through your characters who have their own lives, I'm sure, and their own stories, and how you sort of went about that task. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. Thank you. I mean, my first answer is, how much time do you have? I mean, a base answer. So I did 250 interviews for this book, and the first thing I'll say is that for every person who is named in the book, let alone emphasized the way that those two people were, there are 10 more who are doing amazing work that I got to speak to. And so that's challenge number one, is just the cutting room floor, not just of stories or characters, but of like people that you cared about who gave you time. And I don't have an answer for that, because honestly it made me lose sleep for a year. I cut 250 pages out of this book. It was a 500-page book that got compressed, and in those pages that were lost were people that deserved recognition and who I really admired and who'd spent time with me. So that's number one. Nonetheless, I think the second the quick version of the answer is that, just as your question suggests, in order to make you guys care about it, in order to write something that would bring anybody out to Politics and Prose on a Wednesday night, it had to be a story that was rooted in people. But I wanted my main characters to be these 4 places. And that's a weird kind of ambition. I think that there's so many models across really terrific journalism for people carrying a story. Like I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates and the case of reparations that I assigned to your very class, and how brilliant he is at having this one Chicago man, an elderly man, sort of be this portal into the history of racism in housing in Chicago. And that was so magnificently well done. But we have more models of that kind of narration where there's a person carrying a larger story. And I had this weird ambition, which you all can judge whether I succeeded or not. Maybe not, because this is a relatively dense book. But I wanted these 4 places to come to life, and I wanted to center people as a way of doing that. And so again, I don't know, in the environmental justice movement, they say we make the road by walking, and I am on that narrative nonfiction road, and I will continue to walk it for the rest of my career, trying to figure out how to do that. The last thing I'll say about that is that local histories are part of how I did that. Really to surface and also celebrate the histories on the ground of these places. And I would reflect that back to you as just kind of general advice for citizenship, because it turns out that when you really dig into a place's history, it is this magnificent window into all kinds of things, onto global war, like what brings people here? Why do they end up in that city? As you sort of portal back just from racial demographics, like how did all these people get here? You find yourself in this larger set of explorations about American foreign policy and immigration and everything else. And then, similarly, industrial, I didn't think I cared about textiles, but Massachusetts led me on this escapade over the American textile industry, which turns out is this incredible little window into deindustrialization itself, and how the textile industry moved to the American South and then moved to Puerto Rico and then left Puerto Rico, and now Gap manufactures in whatever it is, 250 countries. And so that you watch through this tiny little city, the sort of fallout of that phenomenon. So, it was a magnificent way of learning. And I would just say that at the end of the day, one of my friends who read the book said that the book made him feel more patriotic. And that was one of the most amazing compliments I ever got in this process, because that's how it made me feel. Because once you really burrow into American places and you learn, so much violence and hardship, this country has been ugly in so many moments. And yet, alongside, traveling in parallel with all of that ugliness are these incredible human stories that were truly inspiring and that just recommit you to the project of, of trying to hold together this gigantic country. And these cities have to do a little mini version of that. Anyway, sorry, please.
So I am a Stanford student or grad.
Yes, I remember.
So I can't
remember your graduation year, though. You're going to have to tell me.
No, 2013. But I came to, out of a sense of community, right? I wanted to hear you talk. I think a lot of great ideas and yours among them come from that place, and that's where I've learned a lot. And so it got me thinking about both Stanford and this sense of virtual community, because I look for it here in DC a lot, where there's a good sort of expat community, but you don't see people walking down the street with Pac-12 gear very often around here. And I was wondering if, with the admission that I came a little late, so you may have already talked about this, but like your thoughts on how technology both makes it harder and easier to save the town. The sense of like virtual reality and a virtual geography, and where is town, and can you create a virtual town? All that baggage that both can make this process potentially something we can get our hands around with technology, or something that we have to actually put more effort into because of technology. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's so smart. And actually there's a whole wing of thinking that kind of falls under the rubric of civic tech about a sophisticated answer to that question that I won't go into here. I want to give sort of a more, personal answer to that question, which is that when you really try to learn the social network of people that care about a town, not all of them live there. And many of them are commuting in from suburbs, or they're from, they're at the state capitol, or they're, expats is the term that gets used for, somebody from Buffalo who makes the rest of their life in DC. And there's this network of people who continue to care, and they continue to be connected to a town that is really struggling. And in Lawrence, it's really interesting the language they use. They have language to describe what they call, it's a little bit harsh, but evil expats versus good expats. And the evil expats are the ones that in particular have been racializing Lawrence as a story of Latino-led decline, which is completely ahistorical and a real abuse of the city's larger history for reasons I describe in here. So there's a certain amount of love for Lawrence that almost metastasize into a sense of loss. And I think Detroit suffers a lot from this sort of storytelling of a place that we love that we lost. And so we are angry at the people who are taking responsibility for it now. But in Lawrence, they also describe the good expats, the people who keep caring about it, and who don't care about it in an embittered sense, but really sort of remain connected, who step foot in the city. I mean, if the stigma goes long enough, then people stop coming. This was something in Josephine that was really important. Josephine is a good 6 hours away from Portland, and it's hours away from the state capitol. And so it takes some effort to go to Josephine. And and there's so many giant states where that's true. A lot of poor places are really far driving distances, if not an airplane flight, away from decision makers. So they have to make a commitment to keep talking to people and to know what's going on. And it was interesting, before the pandemic, I might have been cynical about our ability to really nurture those kinds of communications virtually. But, the pandemic moved them forward even in very poor places. And I think, weirdly, Josephine right now is in, I would say, better communication with decision makers, still with a lot of anger and polarization in the mix, but still in better communication in some ways because people have become more familiar with it. But, if you just wall these cities off and, and then criticize their leaders for failing to save the day, it doesn't do anything for anybody. Anyway. Oh my God, don't let this talk stop there. That's such a such a tepid low point in our conversation.
How long are you in town?
I don't want the conversation to end there either. I'm just in one more day.
Cool.
Coming back soon though. All right.
Unfortunately, we are at time, so I'm going to have to end it there. If everyone would please join me in thanking Michelle for this wonderful conversation.